Okay. Hi. I'm Chang Xiang. I'll be chairing the round. Can the teams put their speaking order in the chat, please? In the meantime, could the panel introduce themselves in the order of the tab, please? Thank you.
Chen Qiang, the chat is disabled.
Oh. Okay, then we can just go a round of introduction, starting from OG, I guess.
Hi, OG here. Hamilton going first, Joven going second. All the best, everyone, and verbal POIs.
Hi, O here. Donovan going first, Caleb going second, verbal POIs as well.
CG.
Sorry, did you call CG? We were.
Yeah, yours. Just introduce your speaking order.
Oh, Jaden's gonna be member government. Jacob's gonna be whip. Verbal POS.
Yeah, CO.
Maya member op Mark Opwit.
Okay, great. Yeah, so again, I'm Cheng Xiao. I'll be chairing the round. All the best. Could the panel introduce themselves in the order of the tab?
Hello, Human Nayak. I'll be your panelist. All the best.
Hi, my name is Rahul. All the best.
Hi,
Hi,
I'm
I'm
Neha.
Vansh.
Good luck.
Okay. Hi, I'm Vansh. Good luck.
Okay, so that's the formalities done. Yeah, please time yourselves. Also please give POIs for engagement. Without further ado, Prime Minister, whenever you're ready, you're here.
Hello, can I just check that I'm visible and audible?
Yes to both.
And okay, let me organize my notes, then I'll just have a sip of water and get started. POIs probably for me.
You need hammer or you got?
Can, okay. No, I've got now. Okay. I want to start off this debate by remarking that oftentimes when we attempt to weigh the decisions that we want to make in our lives based on particular duties that we owe to other people, particular duties that we owe to inanimate objects, we often tend to assume that there is an objective conception of right or wrong. We are not going to argue on OG that there is in fact an objective conception of right or wrong, and in fact we are going to go the opposite direction and suggest that if you were to assume that there is some kind of right in the world that justifies a particular duty you owe to someone else, you owe to yourself, you owe to people, to entities like your country or your government, we think that results in fundamentally worse outcomes. We know that in a sense, this might seem circular to the idea of utilitarianism in itself, but we are still going to prove to you in the end why it is the most important thing to care about outcomes in this debate, and why even the systems that we use in terms of whether we measure between intentions or outcomes is still fundamentally dependent on whether or not you're able to minimize suffering and maximize the happiness of people in society. The first thing that I want to contextualize is exactly what the purpose of these two different systems are in terms of measuring or determining what kinds of behaviors you want to do. The reason why we want to attach a moral weight into particular behaviors is because we just fundamentally accept that there are particular implications that the actions that we perform have for the people around us. And therefore, therefore, in our attempt to seek to delineate between what is right and what is wrong, we are not trying to regulate thoughts, but rather to inform the way in which we choose how to make those decisions. So what we are going to bring to you today is primarily a criticism of why it is bad to care about intentions and why we need to care about outcomes, and we're going to frame this in terms of what we think the world is going to look like on either side of the house. So first of all, what does it mean to care primarily about intentions? Obviously, it means that you trade off a consideration of outcomes. That is to say that you're only cognizant of obligations that you yourself believe to hold in terms of universal duties that you owe to people around you, etc. And that is to say that you would be perfectly happy in many cases to undertake a particular action that is morally worse in an objective sense or in a utilitarian sense, as long as you appear to fulfill a particular duty. What these duties are really varied, and there are many of them. But the issue behind this is to put this back into the real world. Not everybody is a philosopher. We often don't boil down the moral compass to things that are self-evident or intuitive conceptions of right and wrong. Why is this the case? Number one, because fundamentally, we are molded and we are not insulated from the social environment in which we grow up. The way in which we see the world is often determined by the way the world is at that moment and by what people around us tell us to believe in what is right and wrong. We often don't immediately assume, we often assume and take for granted there are in fact objective conceptions of right and wrong, but the implication of this is that we use those assumptions to inform whether or not we think a particular duty is right or wrong to have. The implication of this is so when and why this is problematic, or no, the implication of this is that you're likely to form beliefs that are based on your subjective conceptions. But when and why is this exactly problematic? This is especially problematic in situations with moral dilemmas, aka when there are conflicts of duty inside of the decision making. Because under a system, I'll take you in a moment, under a system which cares the most about intentions, you can have two conflicting duties. You might potentially have a duty to yourself, for instance, a duty to self-preservation, or also having a conflicting duty to protect other people. But deontology doesn't tell you which one to choose and doesn't tell you which one is objectively the better decision to make. And as a result, the subjective biases that you form in the world based on your lived experience ends up informing your decision. But why do we think this is so problematic? I'll take a POI after this analysis. Number one, if we assume that there is an external objective right and wrong, then there is no guarantee that the decision that we choose to make based on the duties that we believe to hold are right. But more importantly, this often means that the conceptions of duty that we have are used to justify the worst actions that have ever been done. For instance, at the Nuremberg trials, when all the Nazis said that I was simply doing my duty to the country, it is a way in which you're able to offload the actual implications and tangible consequences of your action. So the implication of this is therefore, intentions allow people to ignore objective suffering in many cases that are felt tangibly by others who they harm, because we try and perceive and make excuses for particular arbitrary duties. Before I explain why this is really important in the comparative, I'll take a POI.
Would this government bench charge manslaughter and murder differently?
So ultimately, manslaughter and murder are different things, literally because in murder, the person dies. I know manslaughter, the person dies as well. What we're just trying to say, okay, the answer to that question is just, I think the conception of laws on our world are likely to change. Whether or not that means merging manslaughter and murder together really depends. If it is a case in which we will just directly punish a person for causing a death, then we are happy to do that on our side of the house, because that is the measure by which we are using in terms of making moral decisions. But let me explain the comparative first. Here is why we think judging whether or not a decision is morally right or wrong based on outcomes are better. And I would want to note here that one of the biggest potential criticisms that the opposition bench is likely to forward against the idea of judging by outcomes is that there is no one universal metric to determine what is right or wrong. But we fundamentally don't think that you need a universal metric in order to judge things that are right and wrong. And we think that, in fact, compared to trying to choose between particular duties, it is much less subjective in trying to find a particular metric in which a large body of people can agree on. The reason why this is the case is because people on our side are much more likely to operate from basic principles of minimizing suffering and maximizing happiness. At the end of the day, it doesn't exactly matter how you choose to measure happiness or how you choose to measure suffering. It is more important that you are focused on minimizing the suffering and maximizing the happiness in the first place. That leads you to be able to, at the very least, extrapolate from an uncertain or potentially subjective metric things that are objective in by way of suffering or otherwise. The implication of this is that actually, if you think about it, Utilitarian systems of moral belief often care about the emotions of people a lot more, which duties often ignore. The reason why this is the case is because emotions can be genuinely and physically felt by people as reaction to particular actions that are done. In many cases, the ontology ignores this literally because you're talking about universal duties that do not care about what your emotions are. But the other impact of this, and this is the most important, is that you will go out and just say that we're going to get more justified outcomes. The legal analogy, if you want to contest what OO has come up with, PY and me with, is that we still often punish people like truck drivers for killing a child on the road, even if they never had the intention to harm that child in the first place, because we recognize that the suffering that is borne by the child and the family is far more important. This is a really important instance in which, in the world today, we already care far more about the outcomes in very serious situations rather than caring about the intentions that were behind the action that was performed in the first place. Ultimately, we think that people are going to think much more about the implications for what their actions are against the people who are around them, rather than caring about particular duties that are firstly arbitrary and ultimately still feed into the idea of consequence in the first place. So for all of these reasons, OG.
Can I thank the PM for their speech? Next, I invite leader of opposition here.
Hi, can I be seen and heard?
Yes to both.
Okay. The pitfall of the government case is a misunderstanding of principles, morality, where they come from, how they apply, and what exactly they are. So to simmer their case down, you get a matter of offensive analysis on morality. That is to say, the implication of your enactment of your individual dignity upon other individuals. That is to say, your personal choices, the actions you do, and the way in which you weigh those against other people is the crux of their case. They are saying that you weigh the actions you implement on other people based on how they may feel or the physical outcomes that result as the result of the actions that you make are problematic because these kinds of things existing on our side of the house are independent of the deep moral duties that they presume. This is precisely Hamilton's analysis when he said people don't listen blindly to morality. That is why when I treat another person, I don't treat them badly on the basis of morality. I treat them on the basis of humanity, on the emotion, on empathy, hormonal things that we recognize as human beings. The matter in which morality plays the biggest or the most significant role is the matter of defensive morality. That is to say, the way in which other people impose their dignity upon you, and that is the basis of my speech. 3 questions. 1, who shapes morality, or what exactly is a good outcome? Second, why utilitarianism is wrong? Third, I'm drawing the line between acts and omissions. Firstly, who shapes what is a good outcome? They do a very slipshod job on this. Who exactly determines what exactly is a good outcome? If it's a state, then nationalist ideals will continue the very problems they highlight in the Nuremberg trials when soldiers point to the flag and say, this is why I killed those people. In the case of corporations, the outcome is equally bad because what you end up having is even on the lowest ground sadistic ideals of preying on individuals and putting them on the like treadmill, the hedonic treadmill. The problem here is that it's very difficult to weigh this against individual desires and needs because comparison is intentions. And I want to draw a simple analogy here. It's much easier on their side of the house to do things like scapegoat and point to individuals as the enemy, terrorists, for instance, that destroy part of your society. But the contrast is engagement with these dissidents within society on the basis of intention, that they are suffering, that the Houthi rebels in Yemen, for instance, are seeking upliftment and freedom as opposed to just being the demons that destroy your world. The second problem with their case is that they do a very poor job defending utilitarianism. The basis upon which they rest their case is an implicit claim that utilitarianism is right. But this is wrong. 1, because it's incredibly subjective. What you yourself value as util is deeply different from what I may value as util. There is no social organism summing up utility and determining where or not we distribute these kinds of things. The second is that utility is dynamic. It's very different what you view util at this point in time versus what you may view as sometime in the future as your lived experiences change. Third is because, contrary to what Hamilton asserts, we do not think people have a wide, sweeping role or duty to humanity. The problem is that the duties on their side of the house and what you deem to be an expectation of the average individual exists ad infinitum, because you do not draw the line as to whether or not you want to allow individuals to have these expectations placed upon their shoulders. The end result of this and the upshot of this analysis is that utility is deeply unknowable, and as a result, not the fundamental good. The question as a result is, what exactly is the fundamental good, and where do we draw morality from? And we posit that it is dignity. One, because dignity is the basis upon which you attribute value to objects. Second, because it's the basis upon which we assess the actions presently in the status quo, and I'll highlight the significance of this subsequently. To draw the link here, the way in which dignity relates to choice, as I'll explain, is that dignity is choice is an example of the capacity and scope of dignity. The way in which dignity relates to intention is that it's the application of dignity. So we explain here that dignity and the emphasis on dignity as the basis of moral frameworks is the keystone for the analysis of moral belief on our side of the house. What then is this result? What then does this result in the real world? The first is that the rat race of modern capitalism is far more likely in their paradigm, where you have individuals emphasizing fiscal financial outcomes as the basis upon which they value themselves, the people around them, and the social relations that they have. Not the antagonistic relationships this forms they form as a result because of the nature of society, but you also view other members of society in ways that are deeply flawed. The mother's duty to a child, for instance, is now hung first and foremost on the basis of the outcome and the well-being that they're able to afford, independent of the financial situation that she may be in, whether or not she cares and loves the child to the same degree. Capitalist donors, for instance, that can hide their guilt and shame in the exploitation by donating vast amounts of money to charities that don't actually get the outcomes that they want anyways, or instrumentalization. Look, the world on their side of the house reshapes itself into a pernicious, dangerous, reality where individuals can be locked up and chained if it means for broader sake of deterrence, or to torture people in exchange for information, using them purely as a means to an end rather than recognizing them as an end in and of itself. The way you ought weigh this argument against the analysis on OG is twofold. One, they do zero legwork to show why their moral framework is correct. Two, they do zero framework to explain why their moral framework results in the outcomes that they say is bad on our side of the house. Three, they do zero legwork to explain why the morality of individuals is unique, inculcated into the actions that they do and the outcomes that they seek to achieve. Third, on the acts omissions distinction, the problem here is that there's a deep and stark difference between your individual actions and the cases where you choose to omit, even though the outcomes are the same. First, because of extent of agency, if a man chances upon a drowning child and is unable to save that child, the outcome is the same. The child drowns, but we do not lock that man up and charge him for the murder of that kid, because the outcome was not a result of him at every single point in time enacting his dignity at the cost of that child's utility. Second, because of causal history, your existence in the causal history of something is an insufficient criterion for you to be deemed responsible for it. A knife maker is a necessary person in the production of a knife that a murderer uses to stab his victim, but we do not lock the knife maker up as well. The problem here is that the omissions or punishing omissions continues to exist on a wide and never-ending scale. It is impossible to meet these ends, and what you get as a result is the very thing we POI, to which they have zero proper response. That is to say, you reshape the criminal justice system because that is the basis upon which we enact morality. The CJS, the laws that we implement, is the way of people enacting and portraying their morality and shaping the society in which they live. That is why you treat manslaughter and murder very differently in our work, because you identify the contrast between mens rea and actus reus, the desire of individuals to do something, the propensity for them to continue to do it. The focus, for instance, of the criminal justice system on things like rehabilitation, because you recognize that there are individual instances of intention and the remorse they show in the eyes of the judge allows them to have an increased propensity for rehabilitation. We grant them subsequently parole to improve wider society. What is the impact of all of this within wider society within this debate? The manner in which we treat individuals, that we're willing to forgive them, that we're willing to rehabilitate them, that we're willing to punish them, shaped in pernicious ways in the paradigm of the proposition or government bench, because what you have is an emphasis purely on whether or not they did the deed. All of this we reject. Proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the LO for their speech. Next, can I invite Deputy Prime Minister here?
Hi, sorry. Am I audible? Can I just check?
Yes, audible.
All right, perfect, great. Hi everyone. DPM. I'll take my POIs audibly. Give me a second, August, and I'll begin. Give me a sec. Oh, okay, there we go. Yeah, can works finally. All right. The problem that Hamilton points to you is the idea that oftentimes your personal lens is different from what is incongruent with the real world. Oftentimes, what is personally beneficial for you personally beneficial from your perspective might not be for another individual, and through your lenses alone, you cause deep, immense suffering to another individual. Therapy is something that I'm pretty sure most individuals feel via your own personal lens to be something that is morally good, and pushing an individual who is depressed towards therapy is something that most individuals would think has good intentions. But if the individual is not ready to talk about their trauma, if the individual is not ready to open up to another person and you force them to go to therapy in which they regret every single day that they told another individual in the therapist why is it the case that they're suffering so much, that creates worse outcomes. Even if your personal lens and your personal views tell you you are moral, you killed that individual who died from telling that therapist and feeling that depression. That is the case that Hamilton tells you. And the reason why it is the case that people are likely to prioritize their own personal lens over anyone else is also for the reasons that Hamilton tells you that goes unengaged with, which is the fact that oftentimes you don't have a diverse range of experiences. Only you have experienced your own life. No one else has experienced anyone else's life. I don't know what is the morality of a situation from a person who has different experiences from me. This is particularly important because in the situations in which this emotion takes part in, where your intentions are in incongruency with reality, oftentimes these are specific situations in which you are taking a differing perspective from what society necessitates from you. What this means is that oftentimes your own flawed personal views are what dictates your actions, and this is a decision-making calculus that needs to shift. The second thing I want to talk about is how does this actually shift people's how exactly does this shift people's perspectives. Notably here, what opening opposition's case sells to you is highly fucking uncomparative. Because what opening opposition tells you is that oftentimes the people who shape your good or bad outcomes are individuals who are, for example, your nations and your countries who oftentimes sell you these things through textbooks about what is a good or bad outcome, or companies who do things like greenwashing to tell you whether it's a good or bad outcome, or the fact that it is a subject, or the fact that utility is subjective from person to person. The problem about this is that this is highly uncomparative. Your countries also sell you what is moral or immoral through a nationalistic point of view based off perspectives as to why is it the case that you owe a greater obligation towards your country from the perspective of your own interpersonal experiences that then work your intentions in the future. Companies also do this because their advertising also permeate your mind and tell you what is good or bad based off their advertising. This is also true for the subjectivity of these actions in and of itself. That it is hard for you to have it is hard for you to have any proper form of metric in terms of what is a good or bad intention, because everyone has such differing views of intention that you can't congregate and aggregate it in order for you to say one form of intention is objectively better or worse. So the question of this debate should never be about which side is more subjective, because on both sides of the house your perspectives are going to be subjective. The real question that allows for you to tip the debate is which side can have their perspectives actively challenged. Because if both sides can agree that some individuals who have good intentions actually are bad, or some individuals who want to go for good moral outcomes actually do bad things, the question then is which side actually allows for you to shift their perspectives and hold them accountable. And that is the exclusive mechanism that only exists inside proposition. Because understand that when you're looking at things from the veneer of objectivity, that you are able to point towards real life and real world implications, to point towards why an action is moral or immoral. The fact that, for example, when your action has caused someone to die or caused someone to go into Great Depression, they're able to point to that depression to be why is it the indicate that what you did is immoral is something that allows for you to be able to warp their experiences. The fact that, for example, for these soldiers that go to war, that you're able to point to them that their mass genocides and rape has caused the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians is something you can point to point out why is it the case that what they did was immoral. Compare this towards the subjective point of views of what it is the case that what is a good or bad intention, and things drastically shift, because insofar as you talk about things from the perspectives of intention, there is never a good moral perspective as to what is a good or bad intention, because intentions are warped based off every single individual, and what is good or bad shifts dynamically based off individuals, and no one can congregate and aggregate what is good or bad for morality. Objectivity is much easier to congregate and aggregate as to what is good or bad, because you're able to look at the happiness of individuals on the ground and tell them why is it the case that what they did is right or wrong. So the weighing here has to be very simple. The win condition cannot be about which side is subjective, because both sides are subjective. The benchmark that you actually weigh these outcomes is which side actually allows for you to warp views that allows for individuals to take better actions in the future insofar as they want to do something immoral, in which the answer is only government gives you the way to fight back through an objective point of view that is able to directly challenge these perspectives. That is what is debate winning. Before I continue on, go ahead, CG. Or CO. 3, 2, 1. No. Okay. So let's go on to the second. Let's go on to the second thing then, which is about this idea of dignity. Basically, what they say is that oftentimes your choices and your choices like lead towards your dignity, and this is what leads towards you being a normal human being. And this is the keystone of moral beliefs. I think that the first question I want to ask is, what is the actual purpose of moral beliefs? Because they say moral beliefs are this arbitrary thing that is like up in the air, and because of that we should always respect it. But that's not how principles work. When you argue principles, you need to weigh up against the practicals, and you need to actually explain why is it the case that there's something that's good or bad. What we're going to tell you is that moral beliefs exist to be able to put individuals in a good or bad benchmarker for their future actions, but more importantly, to give some form of accountability structure for them to be held accountable, and for things like victims to be able to actually feel as if what they've gone through is not for naught. That is why, for example, we are more than perfectly willing to lock up individuals who may have caused accidental damages, such as the truck driver that hits another child, to be locked up even if his intentions were good. Because oftentimes we believe that even if it is the case that what his actions that were done and what he did wasn't something that was of his own will, that oftentimes the fact that a victim has massively suffered and that they need some form of comfort is something that is out prioritized, because this victim is particularly vulnerable and there's no other way to fight back. The intuition behind this is simple then. Insofar as it is true that we owe an obligation towards victims who never actually consented towards these harms, who never actually wanted to feel these pains and all of these pressures, that oftentimes the people who did cause these harms, whether intentional or not, should be punished in some sort of way, both as a way to prevent them from making further actions and as a way to be able to comfort the victims who are oftentimes already super vulnerable. So this is something that just outweighs the idea of dignity, because I'm uncertain as to what is the outcomes of dignity or what dignity does for an average individual on the ground, but I know what it is like for a victim to not ever get the comfort of knowing that you've never gotten something retributive back. It leads towards things like depression. It leads towards them feeling as if that they were unjustly dealt. And this leads towards things like, for example, victims being revenge seeking and going out and causing worse actions, such as, for example, taking revenge on their own hands because they feel like the state has not worked for them. But even if this principle does exist, let's just weigh the worst case of torturing an individual for their actions, trade this off for being able to stop the harms of massive, like thousands of individuals, and we tell you that on scale we are better in saving more lives. I'm uncertain to why the principle weighs even more highly. For all those reasons, you have to go OG.
I thank the DPM for their speech. Next, I invite Deputy Leader of Opposition to hear.
Why is the thing off? No, the camera thing is off. Oh, okay. Yeah, now it's fine.
Hi, can I check that I'm audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Okay, perfect. I will just assume the judges are ready. Give me a second to sort out my notes. Verbal POIs as well, preferably from closing.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll use yours.
Okay.
Okay, bet. Begin. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Here's the problem with OG. I think they misunderstand principles. Principles are evaluative and hence normative. And I want to note, coming out from Donovan, that he responds to none of Donovan's principal analysis. But I'm going to be charitable here. I want to deal with two big things coming out from OG. Firstly, Donovan says that your good outcome and their good outcome is fundamentally different, so that cannot be the debate. But that's precisely the point, is it not? It's the fact that you cannot really decide who generates more happiness, who generates more utility, because it is fundamentally subjective. That is fundamentally what they have to prove. If he's trying to sidestep this burden, I think that he's automatically going to lose. The second, therefore, I think that Donovan's material just still stands for the simple reason that utilitarianism is just fundamentally subjective and an unfair metric. But second and more importantly, he tells us that intentions are actually harder to access, and this makes the world even more unfair insofar as nobody actually knows what's right or wrong. But I don't necessarily think that's the case, because I want to note, I want to take this trade-off. Let's say that intentions are necessarily harder to access, but we think that it's completely fine. Why? Because note that under the fact that you have to find out what intentions are, the burden of proof of what is morally good or wrong, of what your intentions were, goes up. The primary outcome of this is simple. It affects the way we treat other people. And the secondary outcome of this is that investigative processes across the board become more thorough. What does this look like? Let's compare the comparatives. On Gov, we think that it's likely going to be primarily categorizing based on X. They are going to label an evil act and a person who did that evil act as an a priori evil person. They're going to say that means to say that on their side, there's also going to be things like the perpetuation of populism, for instance, because nobody actually cares to think about the intention behind the person. But at least on our side, what you get is our thought process goes beyond the acts. That is to say that we ask the fundamental question to perpetrators or perceived perpetrators. That is, why did you do it? We think this fundamental question only materializes on our side insofar as we focus on the intentions. On their side, they're never going to achieve this because all they're going to see is good or bad utility. I think this therefore weighs them out. But I want to do some weighing based on world building. Let's talk about a few spectrums within this debate, right? What does prop and gov have? What does gov and op have differently? First, let's talk about the medical scene. I think on their side, when you prioritize utility, what you get is things like doctors killing one healthy person to save 5 more people, or giving healthcare to the highest bidders, to those who can benefit the hospital more. We think that that's fundamentally unjust. Joven says that actually on their side, you save more lives. But here's the thing, what if the life that you lose was your mother, was your family, was your friend, was a person that you were so proximate to? Gut check yourself, Judge. Do you think that that's permissible? I think it's not. Why does our side weigh this out? Because on our side, we protect things like the oath of the doctor, we protect things like intention, we protect things like dignity. When you fulfill the burden of intention, you uphold the enshrinement of dignity. And we think that this is the fundamental thing that we present to you. The second thing is on the criminal justice system. What do we present to you? We present to you a fairer form of punishments. Why? Because fundamentally, intentions cannot be codified. It is subjective. So judicial process on our side will be more introspective and personal rather than like very by the book. And we think that this is just going to lead to fairer punishments across the board. Because the threshold they use is likely going to be A, much more extensive, but B, and more importantly, more accurate. For instance, even if you don't intend to kill someone, you accidentally do, you're already guilty. I think that's enough of a punishment. And that's what the judicial system will focus on. We do not commit in and I think an extension of this is that we also don't convict like incapacitated bystanders. But what do you get on side government? I think that primarily on their side, the framing is that the law is primarily going to be based on what happens at the end of the day. If you commit an act, you're going to get punished. I think that is fundamentally unfair because it's a failure of the system. The example of Les Miserables, for instance, where the poor guy steals the bread, the criminal justice system is going to convict the poor guy, even if he's trying to save his family. Because why? It's unfair. The law says that this is futile to the bread owner, right? We think that it's also on their side that they're going to convict people for not helping even if they can't. This is important because it shows you that we meet the basic prerequisites to uphold basic rights in the first place. I think therefore this weighs out the entirety of GovMatch. I'll extend on this further, but before that I'll take closing. Opening?
Your analogy just now doesn't make sense because if the piece of bread is far more utile to a family of 5 who is starving, in our legal systems, it probably changes the way in which you will convict that person because it was far less utile to the baker anyway.
Oh yeah, but then suddenly the bread owner can claim that this piece of bread was hard work and hard effort, and when you steal it, it causes so much distress and devastation to him. So how do you distinguish? It is fundamentally unclear on your side, right? Just think about it. The next pieces of weighing that I want to talk about is just the balancing of morality. Note that on their side, people like big corporations, MNCs for instance, can go and do things like enslave children, but also at the same time say, oh, this is fine because we donate to charity and we somehow get so much more utility by improving the lives of one village in like some rural African suburb, right? We think therefore this is just bad because you allow MNCs on their side to couch themselves on a bit of outcomes and hide the crimes that they've committed. So we win on OG's accountability structure because on their side, they have a lack of accountability. MNCs can just claim that they did something good and that like balances out the bad that they've done because it creates more utility. Why is this better on our side? Because when you persecute based on intention, you actually take out all the very pernicious and profit-seeking MNCs who only seek to like embolden their own agendas. On our side, you don't have the existence of MNCs who enslave children, who endorse things like, I don't know, the place where sweatshops, yeah, sweatshops, right? But the last and most important thing that I want to present to you is the focus on individual autonomy.
Information.
Because on our side, as Donovan tells you, the fact that when you enshrine intentionality, intentionality is what you get when intentionality is what you get to improve dignity, right? So on our side, at least you focus on individual autonomy. But let's weigh out on why
Information.
on our side, fundamentally worse. No, thank you, Joven. What we have to ask at the end of the day is who shapes a good outcome. Donovan already tells you that this is likely going to be pernicious states with very exploitative intentions who intend to use their people and say, if you embolden my own agenda and suppress opposition dissidents, this is a net good for the entirety of the country. And the worst part is that if this is justified enough, and we think that this is likely to be on their side, because states have disproportionately more power to try and indoctrinate citizens on the ground, it means to say that you get away with all these pernicious states. You get away with authoritarians trying to suppress free speech and autonomy in the first place. On their side, they claim that there's increased vigilantism, and that's bad on our side. But I think that on their side it's even worse because you have more vigilantism. People view vigilantism as fundamentally just and more utile because they see, oh, if the state failed me, then I can do it myself because it creates more utility, and that's a net moral good. You see how it's worse on their side? Even worse, they get more things like state violence, for instance, on the basis that, and on the facade that it creates more utility. I think this is just bad because at the end of the day, what you get on side government is a fundamental oppression of people's rights. At least on our side, when you persecute on intention, people are able to distinguish between right and wrong. If your intention is bad, that's wrong. If your intention is good, that's right. Opposition.
All right, I thank DLO for that speech. That marks the end of the opening half. Next, can I invite member of government to start the closing half? Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. I'll take verbal POIs, please. I'll be checking the chat. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. 3 very simple extensions from CG. First, on how government policy making improves on our side. Secondly, how we force people to be more empathetic, which leads to better actions in the world in general. And lastly, on how outcome is a fairer metric to judge morality based on as opposed to intention. So firstly, on extension, why does government policy improve on our side? And I think this is for 3 very simple reasons. Firstly, on our side, there's greater push from ordinary citizens to hold their governments accountable at the point where they can see the outcomes of policies and make demands to the governments based on that. The comparative is that the citizens have no real way to adjudicate whether the government is doing good or bad because ultimately, the intentions of the government or the people in positions of power are not something that's accessible to them. That's why there's never that push or there's never that is demand for the people in power to be responsible for the things they have done. But secondly, on our side, remove the very common shield of intention that politicians and people in power use to excuse their mistakes. I.e., look at Mao and the Great Leap Forward, right? He had presumably good intentions to advance China, but at the end, the outcome of it was famine, which is horrible. On our side, government officials can't just say that, oh, I had good outcomes and that justifies the policies that I've made, even though the policies have done really bad things. On our side, when the policies do bad things, that's at the point where they have to accept their mistakes. They have to either step down or just change their policies and become a better policymaker. Thirdly, we also force politicians to be more careful and less rash with policy making, right? Because they're deterred by the prospect that they know at the point where they mess up and create bad outcomes, they will be blamed by the public. So on our side, The impact of this is very simple. We get better policies because people are able to hold the government accountable for the results of the policies that they make. And that means there's a better standard of living for people all across the board. And here I want to deal with the OO push, right? Because what DLO says is that like bad people, like bad actors like MNCs can excuse their unjustified actions by saying that they create by saying that they create good outcomes. But like here, I just want to challenge their intuition pump, right? I think if they create good outcomes, that is something that is naturally good. And I think like their examples don't really make sense. If they have sweatshops, that is obviously something that create bad outcomes insofar as like people suffer because they're paid very low wages in bad working conditions. So it is on our side where you point out those bad outcomes, that you hold those MNCs and bad actors responsible. Second extension, why do we force people to be more empathetic and do more good in the world in general? And here on a frame, when people are deciding what they want to do, they naturally want to do the thing and they want to do the action that makes them feel like a good person because they want to be happy with their identity, right? They want to feel comfortable in saying that I am a good person who makes good decisions. But here's the comparative, right? On opposition, people can self-rationalize bad actions. They can tell themselves that they have good intentions and by extensions, they are a good person, even though they did something really bad. I.e., look at super strict parents who convince themselves that their abusive parenting or like their super strict parenting is intention to help their children, and that's why that is something that's justified. So in opposition, bad people never realize that they are bad and continue doing bad things which hurt other people, because ultimately intentions is something that you can like convince yourself that you are good in as opposed to outcomes. On our side, the comparative is that people have to confront the consequences and the outcomes of their actions. And the reason why is that at the point where they did something that caused harm to others, they're forced to realize the wrongness of what they did, right? Obviously, when you do something that's bad and hurts other people, you cannot convince yourself that like that pain or like that hurt or that like result of the abuse was not something that is like that's something good, because like you obviously see that they're suffering, right? So we force others to consider the effects of their actions on others as opposed to just looking inwards. And I want to note the impact of this is huge, right? On our side, where you care about how other people react to your actions and care the implications of your actions on others, that means there's far like just better deeds in general in the world because people care about others, and that means they're nicer, they're kinder to others, and a lot of things like as a result of like power structures and oppression don't happen on our side, because like obviously the outcomes of that is bad and you can't convince yourself otherwise. That's why people across the world just enjoy also a better standard of living. Last extension, why then is outcome a fairer metric to judge morality based on as opposed to intention? But before I go on, I'll take that POI.
So it is a factual statement that influx of immigrants has lowered employment opportunities for locals. Should we all just vote for Trump now?
No, but that's the reason. Like Trump can say that like even though his policies had like bad actions on the US, he can say that at the beginning I had good intentions to protect the nation. I had good intentions to protect the American people, and that's how that's what people accept, right? Because they can say, oh, he ultimately had good intentions, we shouldn't boot him out of office. On our side, at the point where outcome is the only thing that you adjudicate like the quality of an official based on, that's at the point where you vote out Trump, because you can point to the fact that his policies have caused disaster to the US, and that's why he shouldn't be someone who's making important decisions. So last extension, why is outcome fairer to judge morality based on as opposed to intention? And here I want to frame that the intention of an individual is ultimately something is subjective, because like intention happens inside your brain, right? It's not something that other people have access to. No one can surely know your intentions except yourself. Why then is the inability to access someone's intentions so problematic, especially when it comes to judging morality? Because number one, when people judge whether someone else is a moral person, the judges and adjudicators of morality are forced to like guess someone's intention based on information that can never be complete. So justice can never be assured, because you never know if someone's like intention was was good or bad in the first place, because that's something that happens inside your head. But secondly, at the point where you don't have complete evidence of someone's intentions, that is at the point where you create more unequal form of justice, because you turn to other unfair ways to determine someone's intention, right? I.e. based on a person's identity, whether you assume they are a good person or whether they have a good standing in society. And I don't know, this is horrible because it disadvantages oppressed groups in society who are already perceived as worse human beings and who will hence be more like in the majority of instances be blamed with bad intentions. That is why in most countries, for example, minorities are more likely to be assigned murder as opposed to manslaughter, because society society considers that they are bad people who are likely to have bad intentions, and like they can do this because like no one really knows intention. So it's something that's subjective and open to someone's biases. On the flip side, the goodness and badness of an outcome is something that is objective insofar as most of the world buy into a similar form of morality, i.e. things like murder and theft is wrong, right? But so obviously if someone does something good or someone does something bad, you can see the evidence of that and adjudicate based on that. But even if outcome-based morality is subjective, it is possible to create a more objective form of outcome-based morality, because outcome is something that you can experience, you can provide hard evidence for. So on our side, society can vote and create laws, and more importantly, they can apply those laws fairly, because the evidence you use to decide whether someone is right or wrong based on that law is something that exists in the real world. It is an outcome that you can feel and experience, as opposed to an intention that you have to guess and like insert your personal biases into. For all those reasons, CG.
All right, I think member of government for that speech. Next, I invite member of opposition here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Cool. Yeah, so POIs, I guess in React, I'll try to take one. And my pronouns are she, her, I guess. Give me a second. Okay, I'll start in a few seconds. The opening house debate has basically been a wash, where clearly the conflict of this debate has just ended in the realization that, yeah, actually, outcomes can be subjective, and also, what was the other thing? Outcomes can be subjective and intentions can be subjective. Note then that when the closing government tries to deviate from this, they basically just confirm that this is true, right? They tell you, he literally says in his speech that the outcome of a crime, whether, for example, the person that committed the crime is good or bad, can be based on your personal biases. If you have a particular disdain for people of color or Mexican people or black people or things like that, that factors into your decision to tell you whether the outcome of this person's murder is something that deserves a higher punishment or a lower punishment or things like that, right? This essentially proves that the opening house debate about whether something should be, like, clearly the opening house debate kind of just became something about whether a crime's judgment should be by whether the intention of the crime is something that is bad or the outcome of the crime, right? But clearly the agreement is that both of these things are subjective. The question then is, which, when subjective, creates the worst outcome for people in this world? Along this topic, right, there's also very little discussion on what the worlds in this debate actually look like, right? There's a lot of discussion about the criminal justice system, but insofar as you believe that it is just as subjective for somebody to decide the outcome of a crime, aka whether or not this person deserves a high punishment, versus whether or not this person's intention was to, like, do a bad crime or, like, a crime, like a crime that was of a lesser bad intention, right? Clearly, this shows that this judgment shouldn't be the way the debate progresses, right? I think that insofar as we are first able to show you, insofar as we're able to show you how we're actually able to take over our opening house by actually providing you, how we're actually able to provide you like positive material as to how this works, actual practical outcomes, and we're actually able to fulfill the metric that opening government gives you, which is utility, right? Insofar as we're able to achieve these things and flip the arguments that CG tries to give you, we're able to win this debate. First, a little bit of housekeeping for the opposition house, right? I think, and this will also probably just take down most of CG's argumentation, which is, Jovan basically tries to tell you that the ways in which crimes are judged are, for example, a weighing of, like, for example, if I'm a truck driver and I accidentally kill a girl, even if it was on accident, the pain that is caused to the girl's family is large enough that it supersedes my doing of this, which was accidental, and therefore the outcome of this is fair, right? Just notwithstanding the fact that nobody actually proves in this debate why fairness is the most important thing to be judged within the sphere of this debate, right? I think that if we take Jovan's logic and we apply it to his actual world, right? Let's say you're being fought in like an alleyway and like you're about to suffer some kind of like bodily violence, and in that fear you choose to kill this person in self-defense. Sure, you did it to self-defend yourself, but the reality is that the fact that this person is dead and their family is probably going to suffer a large amount of harm and sadness, this therefore means that the outcome of this is just a lot worse than whatever could have happened to you or whatever didn't happen to you, right? Which I would argue is far more important. And the second layer of analysis to this is that if I, for example, drop, like, I don't know, a glass bottle on somebody's head and then they like die, like Killer Little, like if I drop it from like the top of my building, and then this is essentially considered the same as if Hitler like gas chambered a single person, right? If the amount of sadness caused on both sides of the house is the same, despite the fact that the person while dying suffered a large degree of harm, right? This actually means that not only does he not achieve the metric of fairness that he wants to live out, but per my first layer of analysis, this clearly means that the outcome that is going to be suffered by the person who is trying to engage in self-defense is just a lot worse, right? Why then would you want to defend yourself knowing full well that whatever you're going to suffer in jail, or maybe even worse, right, is just going to be far worse than if you just sit there and let the violence happen to you? I think that this is just going to create a world that's far less utility than Joven wants to have. No, thank you. Secondly, right, I think that therefore I think that we are also able to create a world that is the most objectively moral and I think like utilitarian, right? And the point, and therefore there are three arguments for the house today. Firstly, on how on the opposite side of the house, there's probably just going to be a larger amount of the bystander effect, right? Know that like I think that at the point in which no matter what you do, I think that a person that is trying to create a very good outcome at the point in which he tries his best, for example, to save a dying child, but then in his efforts he ends up accidentally causing this child to drown instead, right? I think at that point he's probably going to be considered an immoral person, right? Because the action that you took in order to help leads to a bad outcome because nobody in that society knows for sure whether with or without your help the child would have gotten out of the water in the first place, right? This therefore means that the bystander effect either becomes more common, in which people just don't want to help anymore when they see somebody in trouble, and therefore they just become very silent at the times in which they see actual violence happening, or B, whenever they feel like they want to try and help, something bad inevitably happens and these people are indiscriminately punished by the law, which just therefore means there's just a very little degree of actual utility that happens, and like just a lesser sense of community within this world in the first place, right? So I think that therefore if you're constantly afraid that you're going to make mistakes in the face of like actually helping somebody, right, I think that therefore this just creates a world with a lot less utility. The second thing, and this is where I'm going to flip the closing argument, which is that this just creates a less empathetic world, right? Think about it. For example, let's say like a charity is trying to carry really important supplies and really important like monies and things like that to Gaza, but then Israel stops this charity or stops these organizers from going to Gaza in the first place. This therefore means that the outcome of this is that all those resources and money and things don't reach the children in the first place. And everybody then starts to lose a little hope and a little empathy for these people who are holding the charity and the people in Gaza anyway, right? Because what's the point of me giving to you all my resources, all my help and things like that, if there's no positive outcome that is generated by this in any way, shape or form, right? This therefore means that people become a lot more outcome, they make actions that are a lot more outcome independent in their daily lives. They don't give money to charity. They believe that charity is something that's ineffective. They don't boycott or things like that, right? Before I go on, sure, Joven.
Yeah, so the initial analogy that is really assertive, by the way, is also and their response is also contingent on, is just not true. Because if you were unlikely to kill anyone in the first place, but a guy who was cornering you just chose you randomly, he had a higher potential to harm anyway. So in that situation, where you weigh your utility based on potential harm, there's no reasoning why we should punish the guy who was defending himself.
I don't necessarily understand why that's true. Like literally the way that it is explained is that the degree of like there's no that if it is true in your world, there is no necessary weighing of why there is an intention, right? Why would the government care if your intention was to defend yourself, right? Even if the guy managed to harm you in some way, shape, or form, the harm that you suffer compared to his dying, right? There's no like weighing, like the outcome in which he caused harm to you is not necessarily something that actually happened. Why, if anything, that is the intention of the guy that was trying to harm you in the first place. Whereas the outcome of him dying is something that's just a lot more obvious, right? I think one last important thing to note is that this idea of like weighing outcomes versus like actions, for example, like the whole idea about sweatshops, right? It just doesn't work anymore, right? Because even if your intentions to like start even if you're starting a sweatshop and there's a bad outcome by that and therefore you might be punished in Joven's world, I guess what happens then is that those intentions still have outcomes that are bad, right? I think on our side of the world, you're more likely to be punished for those outcomes in the first place. So, see you. Thanks.
I thank the member of opposition for that speech. Next, I invite Government Whip here.
Hello. Am I both audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Okay. Okay, speeches start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm gonna be doing this speech team by team. Let me start with OG. Okay, so OG brings with us two main points. Firstly, about how it allows people to ignore the tangible, how focusing on intentions allow people to ignore tangible outcomes, and secondly about retribution. Now, I just like to weigh this out because OG's case is ultimately very speculative, right? Our extensions on how we improve accountability mechanisms on government and make people more empathetic to each other are much more certain, because insofar as people can see the condition that they live in, they can see that outside trash is piling, I can see people getting killed or robberies occurring in the status quo. That means that they can definitely blame the government and fight for better policies. This is something that's very simple for them to observe and work on. They also become more empathetic and choose actions that produce better outcomes for everyone. Now, moving on to OO. Firstly, about their short extension about how they make the capitalistic treadmill less brutal. Firstly, they state that it marginalizes the poor. This is untrue because obviously there is nuance for this, right? And I think this is an answer to a lot of up benches weird analogies, right? Because all the outcomes that you look at is based on current abilities. Obviously, the outcome of you being poor is that you can afford less. It's not a vacuum, right? There's other outcomes that also lead to you having the certain outcomes, and I think people can still value it. Secondly, about the fact that they say that the rich are able to get away because they can just pay charities or whatever. Obviously, they will be judged on the multiple actions that they did, right? The outcome that you donate $1 million to charity is that people like your post on Twitter. The impacts that you're killing people in your sweatshops is that you go to jail. It's not it's a trade-off, right? People see the outcomes of multiple actions and judge you on those separately. It's not something that's done together. Secondly, about their point about there being a disconnect between outcome and intention. Firstly, I think on both sides, the goal is to achieve good outcome, right? This is the end goal on both sides. Both of us want to have good outcomes. So when it's based on intentions, the problem is twofold. Is that first, it leads to more rash decision making. Because people are now driven by attention. You're more likely to make many decisions, no matter the outcome. Because to a certain extent, on their side, the outcome doesn't matter. If I at least have decent intentions, then I will be celebrated on either side. So it doesn't really matter what the end goal is, as long as I do something for my own good intentions. Secondly, it's a lot more arbitrary, and I think Jaden already talks about this, and this is very important because we don't receive that much contention with it, is that it is difficult to judge someone's intention. Insidious actors exist on both sides of this debate. They will want to take advantages of people's belief in morality on both sides. On ops side, they're more likely to abuse their power because they can get people to sympathize with them. They can say oh, I tried my best. They can use identity politics. Oh, I'm just trying to do what's best for my own people of America and the people who support me. But at the end of the day, it didn't succeed even though I had good intentions. On our side, it's much more difficult for it to be arbitrary because outcomes are, at the end of the day, objective. You either help climate change or you don't help climate change. The criminal rates either lower or they become higher. It's not something that you can judge arbitrarily. Thirdly, I think it's the fact that people are still rational. Of course, people aren't simply going to be judged on the outcomes of their own actions. Singular outcomes don't exist in a vacuum. We have to consider the outcome of many people. The fact that a baby dies in your arm even while you're trying to save it isn't because you try to save it. It's because it fell off the carriage or something, right? Even without intentions, we can still look at the implications of the many decisions that people take and do in life. I think the weighing here is very simple. Firstly, on likelihood that people can lie or fake their intentions. The fact that people can lie or fake their intentions is very high because it's a personal thought. No one can hold you accountable for in my heart, I think that I just want to cheat, but to other people I said, oh, I just wanted to make this
Point of information
or whatever later. Second, but on the other hand, outcomes are difficult to wiggle out of because most bad outcomes come from bad intentions and good outcomes usually come from good intentions because it requires positive decision making. On our side, we simply deal with these cases where people just lie about their intentions in the first place. Yes, what's that, POI?
The unproven burden is to show outcomes are decided autonomously. Who is Duterte, Trump, or Le Pen likely to tell citizens what is a good or bad outcome?
People can decide on their own. If I see outside that someone's getting shivved, then obviously I know that the person is failing, right? If I see outside that the garbage is getting less and my community is getting clearer and nicer, then like obviously the people are succeeding. Now moving on to CO, I'm gonna start with like reconstructing some of Jaden's extensions, because firstly, they didn't respond to Jaden's extension on the intentions being subject to discrimination as opposed to outcomes, which can be seen and experienced and are hence more fair. On op, it is the people in power who have a lot of social capital who get away with crimes because people perceive them as good people on ivory towers. Hence, they assume that they have good intentions, right? The majority can just say, oh, like the majority will think, oh, because this guy is like the same race as me, he probably has good intentions. On the flip side, oppressed group, the minorities in society, who society perceives as like morally bad, like migrants that people think steal jobs, they're going to assume to have bad intentions no matter what they do, right? So it's just a cycle where like the people who are already marginalized get marginalized more because people think they're bad people, while the people that are in the majority will just be seen as better and better people by the people around them. He also states that like these things about outcomes also cut both ways because outcomes are subjective. I think this is something that both op benches like state, but I think this is wrong, right? Because outcomes are set in stone. Like it's either something succeeds or it doesn't. It's either that you murder someone or you don't. And under like singular under one extension about the bystander effect, I just like to point out that the bystander effect doesn't work because the outcome doesn't happen because of what you do, right? Like if a child is dying, it's not dying because you try to give it CPR. It's dying because it fell in the first place. Same thing with all of your analogies. Also, communities still stay closer on both sides of this debate because at the end of the day, you aren't the one that's going to be held responsible if the outcome of an action is something bad being happened because you're just trying to salvage an outcome that's already going to be bad in the first place. So it's not even your fault. For all those reasons, side CG. Thank you.
All right, thank government whip for their speech. Next, I invite opposition whip to close the debate here.
Audible, visible?
Yes to both.
Just give me a second.
Wait, Mark, what's your POI preference?
Oh, verbal. Panel, I don't know about you guys, but to me, this debate feels very messy. Therefore, the first thing I'm going to do is clarify this debate, right? In opening house, they have an extensive discussion on principles, and that basically forms both the opening house's case. And in closing house, we focus more so on the practical and how it actually affects people on the ground. The first thing I'm going to clarify is what do the two worlds, what do the government and opposition world actually look like? In government, when they say that they prefer a world where morality is assessed primarily based on outcomes, there are a few problems with this that Maya has highlighted, right? The first problem with like just like premising like judgment based on outcomes is that it's like first okay and this also responds to what CG like says later on when CG says that like outcomes are when CG talks about like politicians being able to hide behind like hide bad intentions with good outcomes and utilitarianism, and this also engages with what OG says. The thing about this debate is that like we hold different people to different levels of accountability. Therefore, what the implication of this debate is that politicians are still held to the highest degree of accountability. Trump cannot just like say, but I'm like I'm kicking out immigrants because I care about American people, because politicians have greater capacity to do things because they have a lot of power and a lot of resources, but politicians are also uniquely hold a lot more trust in people on the ground. Therefore, the point here is if this debate is about accountability, is about holding like uniquely politicians accountable, this is likely a wash insofar as politicians are held accountable on both sides of the house because people want good outcome. People like want good outcomes, right? Then there's this like clash or contention on like what the hell are even good outcomes and what the hell are even good intentions, and this comes out in OG, and this is like part of their like a big part of their case. Like sure, be it as it may that utilitarianism is subjective and what makes people happy differs. What we can all agree is that all of us like live like generally similar experiences. So for example, maybe all of us have been bullied and all of us know how it feels to be in the receiving end of hurtful comments and hurtful remarks. Maybe all of us know what it feels like to suffer in debates and to like go in like a to like plateau and just not make any forms of improvement. The difference is we have different like intentions and different reactions to how like to our lived experiences. The point here is this, that sure, maybe the point here is this, that generally most people share a common intention or share common feelings. No one really likes bullying, and everyone detests bullies, for example. So this directly fights the OG contention that people are, like, this fights the opening house contention that, like, utilitarianism and like intention is so subjective, and people will never be able to see eye to eye, and people will never be able to cooperate. But then on OG, what else does OG say? OG says that the OG case is, we allow for wait, so before that. So then what does the opposition world look like? When we say that we prefer a world where like where we judge you primarily based on your intentions, why is this the case, right? Why is this more important than judging based on outcomes? What influences our actions are our circumstances and our feelings, and what influences our feelings are based on our intentions. Meaning to say that like, if I'm going to do a particular act, for example, if I'm going to like stab someone, this is influenced by my circumstances. Maybe I've been heavily oppressed. Maybe I'm being heavily bullied. Maybe this guy is really just like a bad person, being a bad person to me. For example, the difference in the two worlds is that in opposition, no, thank you. The difference in the two worlds is that in opposition, we recognize these nuanced experiences of people. We recognize that there are circumstances and feelings that formulate people's intentions, that cause them to do certain outcomes. This is exclusive, because on a government, they only look at the fact that you killed someone, and they just simply cannot be bothered with why you did it. They simply cannot be bothered with why you did it, with why you did it. Then now I'm going to go on to the three other houses and why we weigh over. Firstly, on OG. OG's case is, okay, we allow for individuals to make more informed decisions or more informed actions that are nuanced to their feelings and other people too. And basically the idea here is, people all want good outcomes, so we are going to force everyone to make decisions that lead to good outcomes. The problem is that for most like lay persons on the ground, they don't really have the capacity to make decisions that are able to appease everyone. So this debate ought not to be about appeasing everyone in the world or appeasing as many people as possible, but rather this debate ought to be about appeasing yourself, because because only you have the capacity to appease yourself. But also, if the case is about like being nuanced to your feelings and being nuanced to helping other people, I'm uncertain how OG specifically is able to help other people at all. But before I carry on, I'll take Hamilton.
Yeah, so part of your case is contingent on the idea that we all have the same lived experiences. What are the lived experiences of a person who lives his life in a slum and the lived experiences of a person who has lived in a mansion all their life? And are their values fundamentally the same?
Okay, great. Thanks for this. So another problem with like the entire government bench is that they inherently oppress like the most vulnerable people in society more. The most vulnerable people in society, okay, in the status quo, we operate on equity. We largely believe that tax should not be like equal, but rather tax should be like proportionate to your wealth. We all agree that bursaries like ought to go to like the people who need it most, those that are financially struggling, for example. In the government world, these factors, like for example your circumstances, are completely ignored. They only look at the grades that you get, and they only look at your academic performance or your sports performance, for example. This is bad because this perpetuates all forms of oppression on the poor. It makes it even harder for them to climb this already incredibly high mountain. This means that on the government, it cannot be said that they help the most vulnerable people in this debate insofar as they're adding more barriers, because now they uniquely have to compete with people who are more privileged, people who have tuition, for example. They have to compete with them for scholarships or bursaries, for like recognition and for employment, at a point in which like your circumstances are no longer important. Then on CG brings to you three things. Firstly, on like increased accountability. Second, on like increased empathy, and lastly, on like a better justice system, for example. The thing they mention about like better accountability, like they say, intentions are invisible and intentions are hard to extract. Therefore, when you focus on outcomes, we hold like politicians more accountable. The difference between outcomes and intentions is that outcomes are like people can wayang or people can be performative with their outcomes. Just sell your outcome during a media interview, sell your outcome when you're telling the press, telling the people, and that's all you need to do. The difference of intentions is that intentions are held to a much higher degree of scrutiny at the point in which your intentions influence your actions. Meaning, if like I say that I'm doing something to help the Indian community in Little India, for example, but someone else on another day sees me like littering and spitting in Little India, obviously this means that intentions are far more heavily scrutinized and far more heavily scrutinized than like outcomes itself, because outcomes are like can be done performatively, and outcomes are things that can be easily hidden. But also like outcomes being easily hidden, for example, in like cases of sexual assault, usually the outcomes are incredibly hard to find because they are done in like like stairwells with no CCTVs, etc., etc. Because people generally, when they're doing bad things, have the incentive to hide it. Therefore, because outcomes are easy to hide, the focus ought to be on intentions when we're differentiating between bad persons and good persons. For all these reasons, we tell you that we risk a more fair like life in general, and for these reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the opposition whip for their speech. That marks the end of the debate. You guys can cross the floor virtually and yeah.
Thanks for the debate,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, judges, you can move to the breakout room once it opens. Brishan, is it possible to open the breakout room now?